Greetings, listeners, and welcome to the Care Table podcast, dedicated to educating and supporting family caregivers of aging loved ones. I'm your host, Amy Huddleston. Through insightful interviews from both industry experts and family caregivers, we aim to provide valuable perspectives and resources. Let's see who we're learning from today. Hi, welcome to the podcast. I'm Amy Huddleston, and I'm here with a dear friend, Kelley Griesmer, today. And I would love, Kelley, to just start by sharing a little bit about you and a little bit about who we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for the chance to talk about the story because I hope it's helpful to people. So my parents actually both lived into their 80s. My mom is still with us, but my dad is now gone. And interestingly enough, my dad's health was in a lot of ways better than my mom's for a long time. My mom has a lot of health issues, a lot of heart issues, just genetic things. Her mother had the same things, stroke risks and heart risks. My father did not have those things, but the difference is my mom's super active, was a teacher for 30 years, loves yoga. So she has navigated all of her health challenges very well and is very active. My dad, on the other hand, was not an active person. The thing that kept him the most active was work. He was a FedEx driver until he was like 65 or 68, and then finally, the FedEx company was like, listen, we need someone a little more spry. But I mean, it was amazing how he could get around. Maybe he was even into his 70s when he was doing that. So when that stopped, he stopped doing anything, really, other than maybe puttering around the yard. And by the time he was then reaching his 80s, so sort of in that 75 to 80 range, I think the lack of mobility just really started to catch up with him. And it was things that he didn't even know how to address. But when you sit, he just sat. And so he would go to the doctors and they would say, there's nothing really wrong with your heart. There were aging issues, but there wasn't anything that was like a huge red flag. But then we got to the pandemic and they were really stuck at home and they really couldn't go anywhere, very much. And that's where we saw the real decline. And it actually started to he started to have memory issues, which I think also was lack of activity, right? He didn't have an amazing diet. He didn't have an amazing exercise routine. And it just so they started letting us know, and it took a pretty quick decline. And to the point that he could not get around. His weight was then getting heavier, he couldn't get around, and my mom's a small person. So we really, my dad's decline was surprising, and we were a little not ready for it because, you're sort of waiting for a diagnosis of something. And even his memory issues weren't full blown, any of the things that anyone would, it was very hard to track. It was almost like he had body dysmorphia. He couldn't figure out how to move anymore. And he definitely wasn't remembering things, but it made it just really hard to reason with him too. Long story short, he had to have a surgery. He did have a gallbladder problem, had to have a surgery in the fall of 21. And he never really recovered from that surgery. That was sort of the door closing because the doctors were like, he can't even, we're going to try to rehabilitate, but it's not looking great. And it was just a gallbladder surgery, but he wasn't.
I think when they lay in a bed too for a couple days, it takes so much longer for them to recover. So when you say for him, he didn't recover, was it could he even use a walker? Was it that like getting up? Was it taking steps? Like what was it that was so difficult?
His knees, his legs, everything had gotten really weak just from not moving around. I think you're right. The surgery really then caused a lot of a setback there because he was, then the anesthesia and all these things. And I will say that I think the interesting thing about my dad's memory / cognitive issues was that, he got angry. He was used to being, he hadn't dealt with any really difficult health diagnosis. And he was angry that he was in the hospital. He was angry that it just couldn't go back to normal. And that made it very hard to reason with him to say, like, I know you want to go home, but you can't walk. And it was getting to the point even before the gallbladder surgery where, and this seems crazy, but this is the cognitive issue. My mom would have to call the EMS if he fell, or if
She couldn't help him up.
because she couldn't. The size dynamics were very different. And my mom we start out at 5'2", and she's gotten smaller since that time. It's just bone loss and that sort of thing. And even as active as she is, you shrink. So she had no center of gravity to help him, or even heft to help him. So literally, even the EMS people were starting to say, like, we can't come help him up all the time, but what was crazy is that the hardest part of our story that won't be as helpful to everyone is that the pandemic certainly didn't help, because it was so hard at the time for any healthcare workers. And so when he went to rehab, was not super compliant, didn't have any energy for the work himself. And I just don't think the healthcare workers were in any position to go the extra mile for him at that time. They had so much on their plates. People were still actively getting very ill in those places, so they had to be really careful. They didn't need someone who was as surly as he could be. And so they sent him home, and he wasn't ready to go home.
So they sent him home. So he was at a rehab facility getting PT therapy, wasn't being necessarily super compliant. Let me ask this. Were you surprised that they sent him home in his condition?
Well, yes. And I mean, and this is one of the difficult things. And, and this is what people deal with. I work full time here in Columbus. My parents live in Akron. My mom has had a stroke, but she's super, active. So she's trying to help him. They're throwing a lot of information at her. And then they finally just said, I think they were a little frustrated that he wasn't working very hard in there. And there's only a certain amount of time that they will pay for rehab anyway under, insurance and Medicare and things. And so they just told him one day, come pick him up. And I do wish that if I'm honest, and I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but it's certainly, it was clear, because I'll be honest, they got home and my mom had to call the EMS to get him out of the car and into the house.
Which just seems crazy that a facility would say this person is safe to go home when he couldn't even get into the house on his own.
Right. And he was going home with
He calls the EMS to help him get into the house. And then where did she settle him in the house, and what was their home setup?
Yeah, so he had pretty much started to exist in a recliner. He liked it because he did have breathing issues. He had been a smoker, and even though he stopped smoking, that caught up with him later in life. The COPD, that was sort of his biggest health issue, even though he hadn't smoked for years. But so he had settled into this recliner, and my mom was having him, and that's what he liked. And he would sleep, put it back to sleep and then sit up during the day, but wouldn't get out of it very much. And so they put him there. But, and I'll be honest, I mean, it's hard for people to hear. I mean, he couldn't get to a restroom. Right.
Yeah. No, so that's what you have to explain. Yeah.
That started to be a real problem. Right. So there were nurses that were stopping by, and I think he knew it was bad that he wasn't getting to the restroom and he wasn't telling anyone. And then the nurses would get there and go, well, it looks like he's gone to the bathroom. What's the deal? And my mom's like, I didn't know, or I couldn't get him there. And then, so luckily there was, a visiting nurse that was stopping in, and they basically, after a few weeks, it was clear. They just said to my mom, this can't continue. And this is where our story got really rocky, because they had to put him back in the hospital. And this was still pre full sort of, it was, late 2021.
Yeah.
And it was right about November of that year. And so people were still very unsure, right, of how to get people safe, especially at that age. And, and so they sent him back to the hospital for assessment. The hospital was overwhelmed. They didn't really want him because there was really nothing wrong with him so they got him, they checked him out. They're like, there's nothing wrong with him other than he's just not capable of really living a normal life anymore. So you need to get him out of here because we need this bed. And we're like, well, but you can't send him home because look what just happened. And so I think this is where I started seeking advice from a lot of people about, like, do I hire home nurses? Do we have to find a facility? And I will say that, again, the whole system didn't help at that time because everybody was so stressed out. His record reflected a lot of stuff about his anger issues, that he was very angry. He was in that situation. So he was sort of listed as non-compliant. And so
and guess what? He's not the first one that is listed as non-compliant.
Right.
So yeah.
At the end of the pandemic, though, people really didn't want anything that was going to be harder. And so we tried a few different facilities that were closer to my mom, very good facilities as far as we could tell, and they all turned him down. They would not accept him as a patient. And it was sad because it really wasn't who my dad was, but it was he wasn't a person that was looking, but I think between the memory, the frustration, the lack of movement, he wasn't going to also just understand and be like kind and gentle, So,
so stop for a second. So so he's in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
You get told, and you're kind of going, he can't go home. And was he still in the hospital while you're trying to research all these facilities?
Yep. And there was a social worker at the hospital helping.
Okay.
But she would call every day and be like, well, I called these 3 and they said no. And I called these 2 and they said no. And we were getting farther and farther out from where my mom was, who's also, and that was the hard part. It's like, well, my mom's going to want to be checking in on him and helping. And now, finally we had to settle in a place that was a half hour away from my mom's house. So she would, ultimately ended up driving an hour round trip most days of the week in her late 70s to help care for him.
So basically when the social worker was calling there, they're obviously asking, his physical, cognitive, talk a little bit about too, did the financial and insurance, did that come into play when you were choosing a facility?
It did. Luckily for us, it wasn't as big of an issue. My mom's very savvy with those things. She had been a teacher. She understood benefits very well. She had signed up for all the appropriate programs, but yes, there wasn't. So what we knew was he would be covered to go into a place, and we didn't really run into anywhere that we looked at that we were like, oh, we definitely aren't going to be able to figure this out.
Okay.
But the challenging part for us came that my mom, additionally, my mom was really the breadwinner in the family. She had been the teacher. My dad was more of a, he worked a lot of good jobs, but they weren't corporate jobs. They weren't jobs that came with executive level benefits. And so my mom, being a teacher for 30 plus years, she had these wonderful coverages and benefits that she could that really, allowed him to go for a long time without ever having to make a decision. My mom also had a very good pension after working as hard as she did for as long as she did. And so my dad hadn't really saved. I mean, he was sort of like letting my mom had the pension, but they had a house. And so, and they had made a lot of financial decisions that meant that they still, the house was still an issue, even at that age. We hadn't paid off the house. And so we were never afraid we couldn't. That's a long answer to say we were never afraid we couldn't pay for the facility, but it was a matter of let's all be good financial planners. What's the right way to pay for this facility with what assets? But it was never a question of where. We really knew we could get him in anywhere that would take him, and then we would have to figure it out. But we were never, we didn't think we could afford one. Okay. And honestly, I didn't have much of a choice. Like, even if there was a wonderful, expensive one, the chances were the ones, I'm going to be honest, the ones that were more she weren't going to take him at the time. They just saw him as an issue.
Okay. So then the one that you ended up choosing, roughly when you make that choice, do they say to you, hey, Medicare or Medicaid's going to cover it for this amount of time, then you're going to start to pay this. So what happened there? Like, roughly what was that?
Yeah. So the good news was that there was a very helpful person, administrator at the place that was willing to accept him. There were questions about whether he needed to be in a memory care unit. He started out in one, but he didn't end up staying in one because even though he definitely had cognitive issues, he couldn't go anywhere. So like, their main concern is on those floors is that, the blocked elevators and things like that. He wasn't going to be that person. So it was so he was able to be moved to a normal, no, I shouldn't say normal, a room where he didn't have to be like sort of contained. But that took a minute. But in any event, there was an administrator, and the prices are different depending on which floors you're on. But she was really helpful to me and really was the first person. So I'm very grateful to them in a lot of ways, even though it was farther away and all those things. She sat down and sort of was like, here's where, here's what you're going to get first. Here's what's going to kick in. Here's what's not going to kick in. Here's where your mom's going to come in. Have you considered talking to these people or those people? And I'm, I would have to dig out all my notes and files from 3 years ago, but she was really helpful in helping me identify like what were the resources that could be used.
Okay.
And it was Medicare and Medicaid. But it really had to, because it was clear my mom's assets, she needed the assets to pay off the house. Or to work on the house. She was going to need to pay for the house, right? So we couldn't, the biggest issue that became right then for me was, okay, she's going to be alone. I don't know where she's going to, how long, or what her health issues are going to be. And she's living in a house that's not paid off at this age. We have to figure out these issues quickly.
So then so you knew that as the daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'm curious, how did you start that conversation with your mom and how did that go?
Well, I will say the lucky part was my mom realized very quickly, honestly, that she did need some sort of assistance with like some sort of estate planning. So she called, honestly, and it worked out well. Even though I'm an attorney and I never practiced any kind of estate and planning, I'm not a senior law person. I was a litigator and so I had no expertise in this other than to have the inkling legal lawyers could help here. But my mom called a local law firm. She looked up the phone book and said, I found a senior care law firm that's down the street. I'm going to give them a call. And so she did. And it turned out we used them. But she did include me in that, which was super helpful because it got very technical very quickly. But she did manage to find them, and it was a statewide firm that specializes in senior care.
So that's helpful, first of all, that she initiated that conversation, but then said, okay, so she used them. So then give us an idea of what all did they help with when if you were to contact somebody like that, what do they offer?
Yeah. So the goods and the bads of it, I would say, having done the kind of law I did, it's not, they don't really hold your hand, right? It's very much like tax or things like that. They do it a lot. They know exactly how to do it. They know who's in what office and who's going to get a letter and who needs to issue an opinion and what the period of time is that you have to wait while they look through your finances and make sure that everything you're saying is legitimate. They knew all the ins and outs. I never had any fear that their expertise, but they also do this with a lot of people at the same time. So the hardest part for me is I was used to working with clients, on these issues and you would sit and you'd have calls and you'd talk with them and you'd answer their questions. And I had to be ready for them. And I had to learn, like, if I have questions, I will ask them and I will expect an answer, but it's going to be quick, and so, but because there's just, I would say it's just a lot of process. And the main thing is that we had to determine, in order for my mom had two choices. She could pay off her home and we could choose a lane to pay off the home, put it in trust. And that was an appropriate use of her assets in the situation. Like that they allowed her to say, okay, you've got two competing problems right now. You're getting older, you don't have a house that's paid off, and you also have a person who needs a lot of care. if you choose to use your assets to pay off the house, then there's these things you can access to help you pay for the care, because we know you still need somewhere to live. And so at that time, and I don't know how often these regulations change, but at that time, that was an appropriate road to take. But what my mom had to do, and I will tell you the one thing she really struggled with, she had to use those assets to pay off the house right then. And she's a saver, and she was a, nest egg person, has been her whole life. And she felt like she was blowing the nest egg all in that moment. And it was like, well, no, by buying, this is your house now. This is your property. You can sell it for whatever you want, but it's better right now. There was this strange push pull of her wanting to have her savings, even though her house was not paid off. And so we really struggled with that. And I finally, but it was the only way, because otherwise, had she not chosen to pay off her house, she would have had a lot more liability for his care.
Okay. So that's how that they educated her on, these are your options, and this is probably what we would recommend. And then did they help at all too with suggesting to separate their finances, your parents?
Yeah,
they did. Okay.
We had to do all that. And I will say the hardest part, again, for her, I think she felt bad, but she had to get documents. My dad had to waive any rights, any ownership of the home. Like, it had to go back to just being my mom's. And so I think she felt bad taking his name off, like he had, and we had to have powers of attorney because my dad wasn't fully cognitive anymore. And so, although I would say, we were lucky that he did know what we were asking, and it was like, and I think the hardest part for him is he's like, he just wanted to move back home. And it was really hard because we couldn't help him. You were sort of in that weird thing where you're like, I know, but you're also like, he would not get up at the facility either. They try to put him in a chair, try to take him down to watch a movie, and he's like, no, that's when he would get surly and be like, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving this bed. It hurts too much. And it was really hard to watch because that isn't something you can fix. Like, I understood his frustration, but I was like, there's two, it's really odd how it's like negotiating with your children when they're young. It's like, I know you want to do both of these things, but both of those things don't actually happen.
And they can't, right? It's like, you want this, but it's not working. I guess you were fortunate in the sense that he was at least cognitively aware enough that what you're asking him to do. So did he have to sign some documents too?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
But my mom did have power of attorney. So we could get the documents done correctly, fully legally. But, what I'm saying is, at least my dad it was a conversation with him. It wasn't like he was so, had such a loss of understanding that he didn't know we were asking him to sign off of the house, but it was she needed to be able to own it. It needed to be hers so she could pay it off in her own right with the assets. She had, stocks and stuff that had to be sold to do that. That nest egg of hers was my grandmother worked for Ohio Bell, which became AT&T.
Yeah.
And to this day, my mom still has that stock. And it's a good asset.
Yes.
So, and she knew it, right? My grandmother, it's amazing that my grandmother earned that stock back in the 60s as a working woman. It's crazy.
Right. It is crazy.
And it's funding this generation. Like, my mom didn't save her house, but was able to finally own her home because of that stock.
So when I would say in all of that process that you went through, which I find so interesting, that here you are an attorney and you still didn't even know all the ins and outs of this, that it
would have taken me forever
to do.
So they would send me checklists, like pull all these financial records, like bank statements for the last year. Like, my son and I sat in a sea of statements. And luckily my mom still got a lot of hard copies of stuff because, we would have been able, we could also find it online, but you have to produce, to do what we did, you have to go dig back into, we had to get all the investment documents. We had to get all the financial records for a couple of years. We had to, it was to show that she wasn't hiding any assets, because the argument eventually was, there are assets here, but they're limited. There's a number of ways to spend them. The nice thing I learned about the process is the decision, one didn't overtake the other. Like the care of my father didn't supersede the fact that my mom needs her home and that she's allowed to live in her home. Like nobody was like moved to a condo. Now I will say there was one person when he was still in the hospital that I did have to go up the chains at the hospital, because when they were having trouble placing my dad, they were calling me and starting to threaten that, there's not going to be any coverage for him. And so we're just going to start charging you full freight by the day for him to be here, which is a lot. And even as a lawyer, I was really shocked by the tactic, and did take it up the chain at the because she basically said, well, why don't you just sign your mom's house over to us right now? And I was like, are you crazy? Like, I was like, I don't even know who you think you're talking to, but I am an attorney, and there's no way that, because it wasn't my, the thing was, to your point, the hospital identified him as somebody who couldn't be taken care of. So, and who wasn't safe at home. The nurses had literally put him back in the ambulance and sent him back to the hospital, because they were like, he's not okay here by himself. Nobody's safe right now. And so there was a medical decision he wasn't safe, but because the benefits were running out, and I also think because it was such a tense time during the pandemic, I'm going to always hope that was part of the problem. It was unconscionable to me that their suggestion was, well, if she doesn't have the money to pay, just sign over the house. Many people do that. I said, nobody does if they have have any guidance at all.
Right. I just can't get over how
matter of fact.
Right. And just so cold and harsh, and also just seems so inappropriate. Like, I think we could maybe check out some other avenues before we go there, but also just.
And also, there was like the real lack of empathy for maybe what I was going through, and I wasn't local, and it was a good hospital system. And so I'm, again, not throwing anybody on the bus, but I mean, it's not like they were in a small rural hospital where, it was, they live in Akron. I mean,
and they're just going to bring, what is she just going to bring in a document that just is like, here you go, sign it over, we're done. And he can stay.
I mean, once I called management, that was taken off the table very quickly.
But it shouldn't have even been suggested.
Well, my concern is for people who don't have the background that I have, because at least having a law degree and having done what I did earlier in my career, I was like, this is not an answer. Like,
it's not an answer, but I do worry, like you're saying, there are people that when you're in that desperate situation and you just want help for your loved one, and you're like, I'll do whatever you tell me to do, that don't do that. So if you knowing what you've known and what you've gone through, let's just say you don't want somebody to get into that rough situation where somebody from the hospital says, just sign over their house. What advice would you give to people where either I'm planning ahead, or, what is it that you would say that maybe you would have done differently, or that you learned that you can help somebody else in this situation?
Yeah, I think the only thing I could say is, number one, as hard as it is, really start to understand what your parents' financial situation is before they get sick, if you can, or and because I knew there were things that probably weren't as buttoned up as they could have been, and it's just hard to do, right? So I think no matter who you are, just understanding, kind of getting some understanding and telling them, like, listen, I just want to be able to care for you correctly. Do you have a savings account? Do you have a checking account? Is the house paid off? I knew theirs wasn't, but I also think it's really, and the hard part for me is, I mean, we did have to pay the attorneys, obviously, but I will say the attorneys we used, it's also like, they know they're offering like sort of a package deal. So it wasn't like a running clock by the hour.
Okay.
That was also why you couldn't expect them to just sit on the phone and hold your hand all day long. They were like, here's the fee, but we're going to get all this done for you. And they did. So I would say never be afraid to call a lawyer, at least, and have an initial meeting. Usually the initial meeting doesn't cost anything. Look for people who either specialize in estate or senior care. Like, somebody who, and honestly, if you're not sure, go to a tax lawyer, because a tax lawyer can get you that this really does come down to, they understand the federal systems and the interplay of all these things better than anybody. So even if they can't do it, they may know someone who can. but don't, and always ask questions of the social workers. But I had a real range of experiences, with people that were super helpful and other ones that weren't at all. And then someone who was actually very detrimental. And, so I think just don't try. I think the hardest things for people to hear, and this healthcare workers do amazing work, but depending on who it is and what role, never, I guess, one of the doctors I used to work with always said, ask for a second opinion. Always ask for a second. Don't, if someone tells you one thing, go find somebody else. Like, don't ever panic and take somebody's word for it, especially if it's going to put you in a very, very difficult position.
Yeah, if someone says sign over your mom's house right now, maybe ask, pause. Definitely pause. So it sounds like, and from what you're saying to the attorney, I like that. They're not saying to you, hey, I'm going to charge you $1,000 an hour for however long this takes. They're giving you a package. They're going to help you assess, probably, I'm guessing, her, just a will, protecting assets from Medicaid, or planning for that when it's going to happen. So it's just kind of a whole encompassing package that you're going to get, that's going to help get all the ducks in a row.
Yeah, because go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, how do you feel now about everything that you've done with these attorneys, how your mom is set up? Because right now she's still pretty independent. She's doing well, but she's had some health issues.
Yeah.
So how do you feel now about her situation?
It's way better. Yeah. I mean, because she agreed that, so now, and this is what I've heard a lot of people now say to me afterwards, like, oh yeah, you should definitely do that. Everything's in trust and I'm the trustee. The thing is that I would never hamper her. She can shop on QVC or, go buy garden stuff. I'm not there to manage. She's not that person that needs that level of management right now. But what it means is that, if there was an issue with the taxes on the home, I would get notification. If she did forget to pay something, if something was seriously in arrears, or, interestingly, there was a law, my mom lives in the woods and she has a bridge, and the township said that all the bridges had to be, it's a little concrete bridge, but it just had people drive over it. So they were like, all bridges have to be assessed, but I get the notification of that so I can help her with it because I'm the trustee. Otherwise, it would have just gone to her. And not that she can't handle it, but at least now I know I can always be helpful.
Okay. So, and as a trustee, like you're saying, what I'm curious about is what happens because I was having a conversation in our last episode about when your loved one passes away, all their accounts freeze.
This is a great question. That's the other thing that so what was interesting is we had to take care of my dad's situation.
Okay.
And the one thing that I really liked about this law firm is they said, okay, we're going to take care of this situation. The next thing you need to do is this trustee thing. And we didn't have to do it, but they explained exactly why we needed to do it. And I would have, again, never in 100 million years, my husband and I are both lawyers, never occurred to either one of us to have done any of this had they not brought it up. It was not super difficult. They're specialists at it. There's 100 million documents you have to sign, but they figure out what all of her assets are, what cars she has, what house she had, what stock she has. We filled out all kinds of documents and said, here's the beneficiaries and everything. It keeps everything out of probate.
Amazing. Okay. That's you definitely would recommend that, because now when something happens to her, because it's going to happen to all of us, then nothing's going to freeze. You'll be able to handle selling her house. You'll be able to handle her bank accounts and all of that, which is, if you don't have that, it could be months that you go through that. Yes.
Well, and I would just say that because not all families are the same. My brother and I are very, we see each other a lot. We communicate. He understood exactly what was happening. He understood I was the trustee. I would feel for people that have a lot of siblings or siblings who might have different, different views of how things go. I've heard of this happening, but for me, it was very simple. My brother's very straightforward. I'm very straightforward. He understood. He doesn't want to be the trustee. He's like, fine. And there was a part that was like, where you fill out like, well, is this for Mike? Is this for Kelley? Is this for, but it's very simple for us. So I do feel for people who have larger families, because that probably gets a little more complicated, but in the end, it is what it is, right? Like,
Right.
And as long as everybody signs off on one person being the trustee, I don't know what would happen. And so it was very easy for them to choose me as the trustee. I don't know if there was people battling to be the trustee, what would happen. That you just probably
You gotta pick somebody. Yeah, thankfully my parents picked my brother-in-law, who is an attorney.
Yes.
And I think that's better. So my sister and I don't have to deal with it. And it's like, and I'm fine with it. I'm okay
It never
with
hurts. It never
No.
hurts. No,
But I do agree with you that you need the family to be at peace, because that obviously just makes it a lot easier. And especially on the loved one, like on your mom, she doesn't want you guys fighting over that. So she's like, it's great that he was good with it and you're good with it. And
as I think about it, I mean, I think my mom and I were the only ones who had to sign the documents. But I guess someone else, if I might have had someone in my family who would have called them and said, like, we don't want this to happen. But I think, honestly, as long as she was cool with it, we could get it through. So, maybe that's the deal, is that, even if there is someone who's not as on board, as long as the parent is is cognitive enough to do it, and the trustees willing. I remember we were the only two at the meeting. My brother didn't have to be there. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. So is there anything else you'd recommend? I would say, in having gone through all of this, anything you'd recommend to people, other than, we obviously said it's worth it to go talk to an elder law attorney, somebody that knows that world, or a tax attorney, start that conversation. Is there anything else that you would recommend or say, this was helpful to me, or I wish I would have known this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I think that I'm sort of blessed with, and again, my brother as well, is that we're very realistic. And so the one thing I didn't struggle with as much as some people during this process was guilt. I kind of knew, like, look, I could look at him, see his condition, and say, like, I can't fix this. Like, there's just nothing I can do. And I could see, that, like, and you would probably know. I mean, I'm sure I asked these questions of people like you who had experience. You don't want him to have to move out of his house, but it was also not really a viable option given the level of care he needed. And I could see people really bankrupting themselves, and have seen in bankrupting themselves,
Yes.
over this decision. And I will just say, to your point, it happens to all of us at some point. So, I mean, this is just a sort of that moment of, like, giving someone the freedom to say, can't, just because they're your parents or your loved ones, you can't solve everything. Once bodies give up, I can tell you there wasn't a darned thing I could do. Like, I wasn't going to get him out of that bed. It was not, he was going to yell at me. It was not, and all you could do is be there for them in the situation they were in. And it was not fun in a lot of moments, but it was also, I focused much more at that point on giving my mom the freedom to understand that there was nothing she could do either. And so I think if people should not ignore the fact that they have to give themselves that vulnerability to understand.
Yeah.
You can help them. You can support them. You're not letting them go, but you're not a doctor. Maybe you are, but even if you are, I mean, I'm a lawyer and I didn't know how to do any of the stuff that I needed to do. So, I think very few of us would be in a perfect situation, especially in a situation like ours, where something was so oddly complicated as to the health problems we were dealing with.
I think that's fantastic advice, because I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head, that people think, I got to do everything that I can to do what they want. So people would listen, for example, to your dad saying, I want to go home, and you think, I got to get him home. But you do, like you said, you have to step back and look at it almost like as an outsider to say, is this reasonable? And look at your mom also. You can't expect, and I think I've seen that a lot over the years, unfortunately, with families, that they feel like, well, mom can handle it. It's fine. We'll get a little bit of help in there, but it's actually, you have to consider, if you really were in mom's shoes, could you do this? And like you said, how many times am I allowed to call the EMTs and ask them to help him up? And he can't toilet himself. So you have to step back and say, realistically, of course there's going to be guilt. But like you said, you still did everything within your power to make sure he had the best care possible. He had a place where he was safe, he was clean, he was cared for. Your mom could still get to him. You did everything that you could in a different way of just not having him at home. But I think that's super advice that people need to hear, that it's, you got to give yourself some grace, that it is not always possible. Those buildings and facilities exist for a reason. People get beyond a level of care that's not reasonable to keep somebody at home. So I think that's super advice. Sometimes it might just take talking to a friend who's been through it, or, just, can you just give me some advice to say, do you think this is a reasonable plan that we have in place? And let someone say, no, it's not. So
Yeah.
super advice.
I mean, it was important for me, like you said, talking to people like you who are in the business and saying, like, that's a lot of work. Like, I don't know that everybody's as objective and honest, because I understand everybody's making a living, but the honesty was like, I'm not sure you can afford that many people. Like, like,
Right.
and the care's not perfect. And when you anywhere, so when you go in, you have to say, like, if a nurse, there's shifts of people, and you have to say, like, he really can't grab that cup if it's this far away, because he really doesn't move. We're not kidding. He can't move. So I think that you also, and I've heard everybody say that, whether it's your child or, you just follow up, because these are people who care for a lot of people. So they don't know everybody's cup positioning. So you have to tell them. But yeah. And I've seen people that have their parents say, I doubt there's one of us, any of us, at least, that say, oh, I just hope I can move out of my home and to a, I mean, like, it's a hard decision. So
it's so difficult. It's so difficult. But like I said, there are, there's a reason why those buildings exist. And it does get to a point where I think to myself, you really have to step into the caregiver role and say, if this is me, and I know I need roughly 7 hours of sleep at night or whatever. And I know, though, he needs help with toileting, getting up, feeding, all of these things. Like, can I reasonably do this? Or would I expect mom to do this? And if the answer is no, then you got to make a tough decision. But I think it's super advice. And like everything you just shared was enormously helpful to anybody, so that they can hopefully plan better, including us. Like, I feel like we have to be better so that our kids are prepared and know,
yes,
I got all my ducks in a row and you don't need to go through this. I think that's something else that we have learned.
I'm passionate about that now, because I do think my parents had never, I think back about it, and my, it's really interesting. My grandfather had very bad diabetes and was type 1. So he was a very fit person and everything, but he just couldn't handle sugar. And I remember him just saying to my dad, I need to go somewhere. Cause he was like losing consciousness and stuff. But how lucky my dad was that his father was really practical and chose it. And I remember that as like a high school kid. So you have to, but then my dad did not, he did the reverse. So I think, it is important for those of us who are watching it to also think about that pay forward.
Yes.
Our kids can't help us, and they always should if we have them, or whoever, nieces, nephews, whoever it is. But they can't be expected to become healthcare providers at some age that, especially if they're not,
And you're also giving them the gift. If you've planned all of this and gotten all of your ducks in a row, and you've maybe even shared what your wishes are, like, you're giving them a gift, so that it's like, you don't have to go through this panic of, oh my gosh. So we have to make the effort to do that. And so I think it's a great lesson.
Yeah.
So in closing, I know I just so appreciate when people are willing to share these things, because I know it's an emotional thing too that you went through. And so what we want to do is make a donation in memory of your dad to whatever organization you would select. And if you can't pick one now, you can certainly let me know after.
Yeah, that's a great question. Given the conversation, what I'd love to check on is whether there's a way to make a donation to like care for the staff or people that are still at that facility, because they did save us in a moment when my mom was always big on getting them little cakes and stuff, and I did watch what they went through. So I don't know, I've never checked on that, but that would probably be a good one if I can figure it out.
We could even send them like a treat basket or something, because that they do not get enough recognition. So I think that's a super idea. So we will definitely handle that, and I'll
Okay.
get the information from you.
Okay.
And I'm just beyond grateful that you took the time to do this, because you are definitely spreading it. You're paying it forward to help people avoid the challenges that you went through. So thank you.
Hopefully. You're welcome. Thanks so much.
Yes. All right.
See you later.
That's a wrap for today's episode of The Care Table. Thank you so much for joining me. If you found this information helpful, would you like, subscribe, write a review, or share this episode with someone that you feel could benefit from hearing this information? I'd sure appreciate it. If you learned of anything during this podcast as far as books, resources, or products that you might think are helpful, be sure to check out the podcast show notes for links to access that information. A friendly reminder that this is not medical or legal advice. This is just information. Consult a professional for your own personal situation. I ask that God would bless you with the wisdom, the courage, and the strength that you need as you're navigating this caregiving journey. And I want to remind you, you are not alone. I appreciate you joining us today. And until next time, stay strong, and I hope to see you at the Care Table.